In the dead of winter, 1873, the hills of Essex County were buried under a silence so thick it could suffocate a man. There, on a rise of frost and fog, stood a mansion of stone and secrets, the Cooper estate. By day, it gleamed like a monument to success. By night, it whispered. Behind those tall glass windows, one man, Arthur Cooper, Jr., carried a burden heavier than his father's fortune. He was young, privileged, admired, and unknowingly walking straight into the darkest chapter of his bloodline. Inside those walls, every ticking clock was a countdown. Every portrait hid a truth no man dared to name. And when the storm came, as it always does, Essex would remember not the snow, not the wealth, but the sins buried beneath it. This isn't just a story about inheritance. It's about how guilt can become a family heirloom, and how love can turn into a curse. Before we open the doors of the Cooper mansion, take a moment. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's legacy. If stories of real darkness, of men consumed by secrets and love turned lethal, are what pull you in, then you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and don't look away. Because once you hear what happened in Essex, you'll understand. Some family names should have never been remembered. The year was 1873. Essex County lay buried beneath snow so thick it silenced even the wolves. The Cooper estate stood at its heart, a vast monument of stone and pride, built by men who mistook legacy for love. Inside, Arthur Cooper, Jr. gazed at his reflection in a dark window, wondering when his face had begun to resemble his father's more than his own. The mansion breathed with the weight of history. Every door creaked like a reminder. Every step on marble echoed through generations of men who'd traded warmth for power. Arthur had inherited everything except the right to choose what kind of man he wanted to be. His father, Arthur Cooper Sr., ruled both the family and Essex with the same cold authority, a merchant king who turned the sea itself into his servant. He taught that a man's worth was measured by what others feared to take from him. Arthur Jr. listened, but never believed. He had been raised among men whose words carried iron instead of empathy. Tutors drilled discipline, advisors praised restraint. Even the servants moved like shadows, careful not to disturb the air of inherited control. The mansion was full of voices, yet it was the quiet that hurt most. Some nights Arthur would walk the long corridor toward the library, the one room that felt alive. There, among maps and maritime journals, he found ghosts who spoke more honestly than the living. He would light a single candle and whisper to himself, "Is this what greatness feels like? Loneliness wrapped in velvet?" Outside, the docks cracked beneath the frozen tide. Men in wool coats shouted commands, their breath forming clouds against the icy dawn. They were rough, loud, alive, everything Arthur wasn't allowed to be. He watched them from a distance, envy hidden behind polite indifference. One morning, he met Elias, a shipwright with hands carved by salt and wind. The man worked with quiet focus, shaping a broken hull as though he were stitching life back into it. Arthur was fascinated. In Elias's world, purpose didn't need permission. Their conversations began awkwardly, but soon grew into routine. Elias spoke of storms that swallowed fleets whole, of nights when lightning painted the sky with fire. He laughed when Arthur asked if he was ever afraid. "Fear's just proof you're still alive," he said. Arthur carried those words back to the mansion, replaying them in the silence of his father's corridors. It was strange, how a man with calloused hands could feel freer than an air born into silk. The thought burned inside him, dangerous and intoxicating. Dinner at the Cooper estate was a ceremony of control. Arthur Sr. sat at the head, surrounded by business associates and ledgers. Every toast was to profit, every smile a performance. "Men remember victories," the elder Cooper would say, "not emotions." Arthur drank, but the words tasted bitter. He began keeping a private journal, hiding it beneath the floorboards of his study. The entries were confessions he could never speak aloud, about the hypocrisy of wealth, the coldness of duty, the yearning for something real. Writing was rebellion in ink. Weeks passed, and the relationship with Elias deepened. They met at dawn near the harbor, watching the ships cut through fog like beasts of burden. Elias taught him to tie knots, to read the wind, to respect the sea as both ally and judge. Arthur listened like a student learning a forbidden faith. The first storm of February hit Essex like vengeance. Thunder cracked across the bay, and Arthur found himself running toward the docks instead of away. He stood beside Elias as the men secured lines against the furious tide. For the first time, fear and exhilaration lived in the same breath. When it ended, the docks were in ruin. But Arthur felt reborn. His coat was drenched, his pulse wild. Elias clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Now you've seen what real power looks like. It's never in the man who owns the ships, only in the one who faces the storm." That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He walked the halls barefoot, the marble cold beneath his feet. His father's portrait loomed above the grand staircase, eyes painted to follow him. Arthur whispered, "You built this empire on control. I'll build mine on truth." The next morning he made a decision, one he couldn't explain even to himself. He began spending more time at the harbor, less at the mansion. Rumors spread among the servants, the air of Cooper fortune mingling with laborers, unthinkable. But Arthur didn't care. Elias became his compass. Together they repaired ships, shared whiskey by the fire, spoke about life beyond Essex, the kind of life built on sweat instead of silver. Arthur began to imagine escape, not as rebellion but redemption. Then came the letter. Sealed with his father's crest, it waited on his desk like a snake. Inside, a summons. "Return to the mansion immediately. Matters of inheritance cannot wait." Arthur's chest tightened. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one waiting at home. He arrived to find his father seated by the fire, flanked by advisors. The air smelled of tobacco and judgment. "You've been seen at the docks," the elder Cooper said, "among laborers, among commoners. Do you wish to shame this family?" Arthur stood silent. His father's voice grew sharper. "You are a Cooper, boy. You don't work. You command. Remember that." Every word was a chain tightening around his throat. But that night, Arthur wrote something in his journal that changed everything. "If command means emptiness, I choose exile. If wealth means silence, I choose voice." It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was declaration. Days later, Elias prepared to leave Essex on a trading voyage. The morning fog clung to their coats as they stood by the water. "You could come," Elias said quietly. "See the world, leave this place behind." Arthur almost said yes. The harbor wind carried salt and promise, but behind him, the mansion's silhouette loomed, an anchor disguised as home. He whispered, "Not yet." Elias nodded, understanding more than words could hold. "Then find your truth here," he said. "But don't let their ghosts write your story." And with that, he boarded the ship. Arthur watched the vessel vanish into mist, his heart torn between duty and freedom. The waves crashed against the pier like a warning, or perhaps an invitation. That night, thunder rolled again over Essex. Arthur sat alone in the library, reading the old journal he'd found weeks before. In the margins, a forgotten hand had written, "Every heir carries a shadow. The question is, does he serve it or defy it?" He closed the book slowly, the firelight flickering across his face. For the first time, Arthur Cooper Jr. understood that his story wasn't written yet, but if he didn't take control soon, someone else would. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet, endless, heavy. Inside, a single candle burned against the dark, and one man's resolve began to take shape. and somewhere beyond the harbor beneath the same moon, the sea waited, patient, eternal, whispering the same truth Elias had spoken. The storm had only just begun. The morning after the storm, Essex was wrapped in fog thick enough to drown the sun. The Cooper mansion looked softer under it, but Arthur knew softness was a lie. It never lasted long here. His father's death had not yet come, but its shadow already lived in every hallway. Arthur Cooper Sr. was coughing more these days, his voice losing the authority that once commanded ships and men alike. Silence had started replacing dominance. Arthur watched him from a distance, not with hate, but with the confusion only sons understand. He wanted to love the man who built him, yet every lesson taught had carved away a piece of his soul. The business empire ran like clockwork, even as the master weakened. Men in wool coats arrived daily with ledgers and papers. They bowed to the old man but looked at Arthur as if measuring his worth in silence. One of them, a thin, sharp-faced clerk named Henry, stayed longer than most. He was young but carried the air of someone who had seen too much. His loyalty to the Coopers seemed genuine, almost personal. Henry began visiting Arthur's study after hours, offering reports, guidance, conversation. They spoke of ships, markets, philosophy, and power. Arthur found himself drawn to the man's intensity, the quiet conviction that lived behind every word. In that mansion where emotion was forbidden, Henry's presence was rare oxygen. He spoke truthfully, even when it cut deep. "Your father built wealth, but not peace," he said once. "Maybe your purpose is to finish what he never started." Arthur remembered that line for days. It became a spark in the darkness. Dangerous but alive. The more they spoke, the more he began to trust Henry in ways he never trusted any man before. One evening, Henry arrived carrying an old chest, saying it came from the archives. Inside were documents Arthur had never seen, sealed letters, receipts, and an aged journal labeled A.C. Sr., 1851. The ink had bled, but the words still burned. Arthur hesitated before opening it. His father's private writing felt sacred, forbidden. But curiosity is a slow poison. Once tasted, it demands more. He read the first line aloud. "Every empire hides a sin. Mine began in Salem." What followed made Arthur's breath stop. It spoke of a winter voyage, of a liaison with a stranger in a distant port, and of consequences buried by gold and guilt. The final entry mentioned a child, a son sent away in secrecy. Arthur reread it 3 times. The handwriting was his father's. The shame was his legacy. His mind twisted through possibilities. Had his father fathered another heir? Another Cooper living in silence somewhere beyond Essex? Henry's eyes flickered in the firelight. "If it's true," he said softly, "then your inheritance isn't clean. You share blood with a man no one was ever meant to know about." His tone carried no judgment, only grim understanding. Arthur slammed the journal shut, as if closing it would erase the revelation. But knowledge never unlearns itself. The walls of the mansion seemed to lean closer that night, listening, waiting for him to break. Days turned into weeks. Arthur investigated quietly, sending trusted messengers to Salem, tracing ship logs from 1851. Every record led deeper into fog, until one finally revealed the name of a boy, Michael Hale. A fisherman, same birth year as Arthur, same striking resemblance in a faded photograph attached to the registry. The world tilted. The journal hadn't lied. Somewhere beyond the docks, he had a brother. Arthur rode to Salem without telling anyone, not even Henry. The journey was bitter and cold. Every mile carried him away from the mansion's control and closer to a truth that might destroy him. He found Michael near the coast, mending nets beside the sea. The resemblance was uncanny. The same eyes, the same jawline shaped by pride and fatigue. When Arthur spoke, it was like hearing his own voice echoed through another life. Michael was wary at first. He had heard rumors of the wealthy Coopers, of their fortune built on ships and shadows. When Arthur revealed his name, the air between them froze. The world became very small in that moment. They talked for hours, the tide rolling in like a witness. Arthur shared what he knew. Michael listened without expression. When silence came, Michael finally said, "If he was your father, he was never mine. You got his name. I got his absence." Those words cut deeper than Arthur expected. They were brothers by blood, strangers by life. The revelation didn't bring comfort, only reflection. Both men had inherited the same ghost, one through luxury, the other through abandonment. Arthur returned to Essex changed. He looked at his father now, not as a titan, but as a man who'd spent decades building walls to keep out his own guilt. For the first time, Arthur pitied him. Henry noticed the difference. His tone shifted too, more deliberate, almost protective. "You've seen what truth costs," he said. "Now decide if you'll spend it or bury it." Arthur couldn't answer. He was torn between revelation and ruin. That night, thunder rolled again over the estate. Arthur entered his father's chamber and found the man asleep, frail, half swallowed by the bed's enormity. On the nightstand lay the same journal Arthur had hidden, open, as if waiting. His father's eyes opened. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a trembling voice, Arthur Sr. said, "So you've read it. Then you know what sins built this house." His cough cracked the silence. "You weren't meant to." Arthur's anger broke loose. "You made me heir to a lie. You abandoned your own blood, and now you expect me to bear it with pride?" His father stared through him, hollow. "Every man pays his debt, son, even in silence." The conversation ended in echoes. Hours later, the old man's breathing stopped. The empire changed hands before sunrise. Essex had a new master, one born into guilt, crowned in truth. Henry stood beside him at the burial, the only man unflinching in the bitter wind. "You've inherited everything," he murmured. "Wealth, power, and a ghost you can't bury." Arthur didn't reply. He just watched the soil fall, knowing it would never cover enough. The mansion became quieter in the weeks that followed. Servants whispered of change, of letters burned, of the heir who now spent nights pacing the corridors like his father once had. Arthur's journal filled faster than ever before. Each entry was a confession, about Michael, about the sea, about the cost of carrying another man's sin. But as the ink spread, a strange peace began to settle. Perhaps truth, no matter how ugly, was still cleaner than silence. Henry stayed by his side, managing affairs, handling the estate, speaking little. Their companionship was forged in necessity, but hardened into something like brotherhood, not of blood, but of shared burden. One night, standing before the fireplace, Arthur finally said it aloud. "My father's sin was secrecy. Mine will not be." Henry nodded. "Then speak it. Let the world judge what it cannot understand." Arthur decided. The next morning, he sent word to Salem. He summoned Michael to Essex, offering not apology but acknowledgement. The Cooper name, cursed as it was, would no longer be divided by silence. When Michael arrived, the two men stood again before the sea, this time side by side. No words, just understanding. The blood between them was both wound and bridge. And in that moment, as the waves broke beneath a gray sky, Arthur finally understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't what a man built. It was what he dared to face. Inside the mansion, Henry watched from the window. For the first time, the halls of Cooper Estate felt lighter, not with joy, but with honesty. The curse had shifted, but it hadn't ended, not yet. As the tide receded, Arthur whispered to himself, "Blood binds, truth frees." But in the distance, thunder rolled again, low, persistent, and promising that peace was never more than temporary. The shadow of his father lingered in the corners of every room, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The Cooper mansion no longer felt alive. Its corridors were too still, its air too heavy. After his father's death, Arthur filled the silence with purpose, or tried to convince himself that he did. The empire needed control. Ships, contracts, men, ledgers, all of it demanded his attention. But the more he ruled, the more he realized he was becoming what he despised. Power didn't liberate him. It chained him to ghosts. Henry remained close, the last echo of trust inside the mansion. Together they handled every demand, every debt. But Henry saw what Arthur refused to admit. The estate had become a prison made of glass and guilt. Arthur began hosting gatherings, inviting merchants and industrialists, trying to appear as though life had returned. The men drank, laughed, and toasted to progress. Yet behind every smile lingered whispers about the heir's solitude and his unshakable melancholy. At night, he would stand in the library with a glass of whiskey, staring at his father's portrait. The face that had haunted his childhood now looked smaller, almost afraid. Still, its eyes never stopped watching. Elias returned to Essex that winter. The sea had aged him, his beard gray, his voice deeper. When he entered the mansion, the servants looked uneasy. He wasn't their kind, but Arthur embraced him like a brother lost to the waves. They spoke for hours. Elias shared stories of foreign ports, storms survived, and fortunes made at terrible cost. Arthur listened with the hunger of a man searching for meaning beyond inheritance and marble walls. Henry joined them one evening. 3 men, 3 versions of loyalty: the friend, the advisor, the heir. As the whiskey burned through conversation, a strange confession began to surface between them. Elias revealed that he had once served aboard one of Arthur Sr.'s ships, the Margaret. He spoke of cruel orders, men punished for mistakes not their own, and a secret cargo locked below deck. Arthur's pulse tightened. His father's secrets were far from buried. Henry urged caution, but Arthur demanded truth. "What was in that cargo?" he asked. Elias's gaze hardened. "Not goods," he said. "People, men who never made it home. Your father bought silence with blood." The room went cold. The revelation cracked something inside Arthur. He had spent years carrying his father's name with reluctant pride. Now that pride turned to ash. The Cooper fortune was built not on trade, but betrayal. Days later, Arthur confronted the archives, searching through ledgers with trembling hands. Hidden between accounts were coded notes, marked with initials and dates that aligned with the Margaret's voyages. The truth was irrefutable. His father had trafficked human lives. The knowledge was poison. It seeped into his sleep, his meals, his thoughts. Every creak of the mansion became an accusation. Every portrait seemed to whisper, "You inherited more than wealth. You inherited sin." Elias tried to help, urging him to sell the business, to escape Essex and start anew. But Arthur couldn't. "This house owes the world a debt," he said, "and I'm the only one left to pay it." Henry grew distant, watching Arthur's unraveling with the patience of a man torn between loyalty and fear. He knew obsession when he saw it. He had seen it in the elder Cooper before his mind collapsed under guilt. Arthur began writing letters to the families of the missing, the men taken by his father's greed. Each letter was an apology, sealed with the Cooper crest. It was his penance, but no forgiveness ever came. The storm that struck Essex that March felt personal. Windows rattled, waves smashed against the cliffs, and Arthur sat in the library refusing to move. The sea roared like an accusation he couldn't answer. Elias and Henry found him there, soaked and pale, muttering names from the old ledgers. "They deserve to live," he kept saying. "He turned them into ghosts, and I carry their silence." Henry grabbed his arm. "You can't fix the past, Arthur. You can only face it." But Arthur pulled away. "Then I'll face it where it began, at sea." His eyes burned with resolve. By dawn, he was gone. The servants reported seeing him ride toward the harbor, where the waves still raged. Elias followed without hesitation, Henry close behind, both knowing this was no ordinary journey. At the docks, Arthur stood beside a battered vessel, the Margaret's twin. The wind howled, tearing through his coat. He turned to Elias and said, "If my father's sins were born on water, then so will my redemption." Elias tried to stop him, gripping his shoulder. "The sea doesn't forgive, Arthur. It only remembers." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Then let it remember me differently." Without another word, he stepped aboard. Henry watched from the pier as the ship pushed into the storm. The waves devoured it, each crash sounding like a heartbeat fading in the distance. Elias followed in a smaller craft, refusing to abandon him. For 3 days, the storm ruled Essex. Then it ended. The wreckage washed ashore, planks, ropes, a single silver cufflink bearing the Cooper crest. Of Arthur and Elias, there was no sign. Henry became the last keeper of the Cooper legacy. He closed the mansion's doors, sealed the ledgers, and buried the family name with the same care one buries the dead. Essex never spoke of the Coopers again. But late at night, fishermen claimed they saw lights far out at sea, a lantern swaying in endless darkness, moving against the current, as if guided by hands unseen. Some said it was Arthur, still paying his debt. Others said it was the sea itself, keeping his story alive. The heir who defied silence, who faced the sins of his bloodline and vanished beneath the waves. Either way, the legend endured. Years later, Henry would sit by the fire, staring into the flame, whispering he wanted peace. The sea gave him truth instead. Then he'd fall silent, as if waiting for a reply carried on salt and wind. The Cooper mansion decayed, vines consuming its walls, windows shattering under time's quiet cruelty. But in the library, one candle always seemed to burn, faint, flickering, and impossibly eternal. Some nights, when storms rolled in, sailors swore they heard voices carried on the wind, 2 men, laughing, arguing, forgiving. The sea, it seemed, had found a way to keep them. And so the legend of Arthur Cooper Jr. became more than history. It became a warning whispered by men who understood that guilt, once inherited, never truly dies. It only changes its shape. The Cooper mansion stood empty for years, its halls echoing only the wind. The servants were gone, the candles cold, and the portraits gathering dust like silent witnesses to a vanished lineage. Henry returned one winter evening, older, slower, but still drawn to the ruins. Snow blanketed the grounds, muffling every sound. The gates hung open, groaning against the wind. He crossed the threshold like a man entering a tomb. Inside, time had stopped. Furniture draped in sheets, staircases warped by damp, the faint smell of salt lingering in the air. It was as if the sea itself had followed him home. He lit a single lantern, its glow trembling across cracked walls. In the library, the book still stood untouched. On the desk lay Arthur's journal, its pages curled, the ink faded but legible. Henry hesitated before opening it. His hands shook, not from age, but memory. Arthur's last words were written there, not to the world, but to him. When truth becomes heavier than sin, confess to the silence. The words echoed through Henry's chest like a heartbeat. He sat by the dying fireplace, the same spot where Arthur once dreamed, and began to write his own confession. He wrote of the empire's decay, of the buried truths, of the bloodlines that drowned in guilt. Every line felt like a stone lifted from his soul. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was preserving the truth. Outside, a storm gathered over Essex. Lightning illuminated the cliffs. thunder rolling like distant cannon fire. The mansion groaned with each gust, as though protesting the resurrection of its memories. Henry continued page after page. He wrote of Elias's loyalty, of Arthur's descent, of the sea swallowing both. He wrote of how the world forgot them too quickly, as if forgetting could cleanse it. Then he wrote about himself, the silent witness, the keeper of secrets, the man who had survived only to remember. "Perhaps," he wrote, "my sin was watching and saying nothing." A floorboard creaked behind him. He turned, expecting emptiness. But the air felt different, charged, familiar. A whisper drifted through the room, not carried by wind, but by something older. "Henry!" The voice was low, tired, unmistakably Arthur's. Henry froze, the pen slipping from his fingers. He turned slowly, his heart a drumbeat of disbelief and longing. By the doorway stood a figure, soaked, gaunt, eyes like stormlight. Arthur Cooper Jr. looked alive and dead all at once, as though the sea had carved him from salt and memory. Henry rose to his feet. "You're—" Arthur lifted a trembling hand. "Not alive. Not as men are. But I couldn't rest. Not yet." His voice carried both thunder and sorrow. Arthur stepped closer. The lantern's glow painted his face in gold and shadow. "You were right," he said. "The truth had to live somewhere. I came to hear it spoken." Henry's throat tightened. "I kept your name clean, burned the ledgers, buried the past." Arthur smiled faintly. "You buried the proof, not the truth. It lives here." He touched his chest. "And here." He gestured toward Henry. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to pause. The mansion itself seemed to listen. Henry whispered, "Then let me finish it, once and for all." Arthur nodded. They sat together at the desk, the living and the dead, writing side by side. Every sentence felt like absolution. Every page another wave crashing against the rocks of memory. When Henry looked up again, Arthur was gone. Only the scent of sea air remained, faint and sharp. The lantern flickered once, then steadied, as if acknowledging the ghost's departure. He finished the final line. "Here ends the name of Cooper. Let history remember the men, not the monsters." Then he closed the book, sealing both confession and curse within its pages. Dawn crept across the horizon, pale and hesitant. The storm had passed, leaving the estate buried in snow. Henry stepped outside, the cold biting through his coat but clearing his mind. He carried the journal to the cliffs where Arthur and Elias had vanished. The sea was calm now, mirror flat, reflecting the gray sky like an unspoken truth. He placed the journal on the edge. The wind lifted the pages, fluttering them like wings. Henry whispered, "He found peace. Let him keep it." Then, without hesitation, he tossed the book into the waves. It sank slowly, swallowed by the tide. For a brief moment, sunlight pierced the clouds, striking the water with golden fire. Then it was gone. Silence returned to Essex. Years passed. Travelers avoided the cliffs, calling them cursed. Sailors swore they saw two figures walking the shoreline during storms, one cloaked in black, the other in white. Henry's name vanished from records. Only fragments of his confession remained, found decades later by archivists who couldn't tell fact from myth. The handwriting was steady, the tone eerily calm. It ended with a single line. "The sea keeps what men can't forgive." Scholars debated its meaning, priests called it heresy, but those who visited Essex felt its truth in the wind. When the mansion finally collapsed, the land was sold, but no one built there again. Locals said the ground still whispered at night, low, steady, like a man reciting a prayer he never finished. And sometimes when fog rolled in from the sea, fishermen swore they saw lights on the cliffs, not lanterns, but souls keeping watch. Two men standing guard over the sins they finally confessed. The legend spread quietly, passed from sailor to sailor, from one tavern to another. They called it the curse of the Coopers, though in truth it was never about curses, only consequences. Because every empire built by men eventually drowns in its own silence. And every name carried too proudly ends the same way, as a whisper lost to the tide. So when the wind howls over Essex and the waves strike the shore, remember this. Somewhere beneath that endless sea, two brothers keep their vigil, guardians of truth, prisoners of legacy. And the world, as always, moves on, forgetting that once, two men dared to confess what others died hiding. The mansion may be gone, but their voices remain, echoing through eternity.